This week I was meant to get some fertilizer sowed, but the weather hasn't played ball and that hasn't happened. So instead we are going to talk about fertilizer. And it's kind of topical for two reasons. Number one, this week the Republic of Ireland announced that they are banning the use of unprotected urea from 2026. We will be taking a look at what implications that is likely to have. And also more locally here in Northern Ireland, we have seen our fertilizer prices rocket over the last several weeks. So we are going to ask the question, why? And finally, we are going to try and figure out what is likely to happen to fertilizer prices here in the UK and Europe over the next several months and years. This is actually a video I've wanted to make for a long time, but it's just one of them topics that's really hard to decide what angle to take on it. So I've decided to try and write out a little bit of a structure for this video. I definitely do think I lose a bit of the personality when I do this, but honestly, it's just one of them topics that you have to have something to rely on. So let's start with why our fertilizer prices are rising again. Well, first up, it's the obvious answer. It's because gas prices in Europe are rising again. Natural gas is the key ingredient in making nitrogen fertilizer, and when that increases, the price will also increase. And we can actually get a sense of how much of the extra price that gas price increases are adding. And we can get that from Yara's Q4 report. They say they expect to spend 85 million extra on gas in Q1 in 2025 and 225 million extra in gas in Q2. And when you convert that back by how many tons of fertilizer they manufacture, you end up with a price increase of £20 in Q1 and £50 in Q2. Now, for those of you out there who have tried to buy fertilizer recently, you will know that the price increases have already exceeded the increase in gas price expected in Q2. And it has certainly increased more than the £18 a tonne, which Yara say they are going to spend extra on production costs currently. So what's going on? Well, I'm pretty certain that any of us farmers know what's going on. Yara and the fertilizer industry want to make more profit, and they are using a small increase in gas price to justify gouging farmers for more money. And in case anyone thinks that's not true, take a look at how much money the fertilizer companies made in 2022. But we'll get to that later in the video. So when it comes to what's likely to happen for the rest of the year with fertilizer prices, I'm not going to give you my opinion. I'm just going to give you the opinion of Yara from its Q4 report. They expect fertilizer prices to be strong, but it is dependent on Chinese exports. The caveat to all of that is that, of course, Yara would say that, and they also have record high production at the minute, which means that there is definitely a part of their prediction is dependent on demand. And whilst demand from dairy and beef farmers is likely to be very good because of the high prices, arable farmers are not seeing them high prices, and if the price of grains does not increase, perhaps that will soften demand, which could lead to fertilizer prices not increasing, but rather decreasing as the year goes on. And that is probably my hunch, but definitely don't take that for gospel. Longer term here in Europe, we have some really big challenges when it comes to fertilizer prices. And this time it is nothing to do with the disastrous energy policy of the EU and high gas prices. It is actually to do with government meddling in the fertilizer industry. Let's start with the CBAM legislation coming through from Europe. CBAM stands for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and it is essentially an import tariff on all fertilizers into the EU. And that single piece of legislation is expected to add between £20 and £40 a tonne on our fertilizer bills. It is essentially a mechanism to try and level the playing field and stop fertilizer producers just moving ammonia production outside of Europe, which is what is currently happening. The interesting thing with the CBAM legislation is that the EU Commission decided not to solve the energy issues within Europe, not to fix our broken energy market, but instead to just increase the cost of fertilizer so that it is all of us farmers who end up footing the bill. You would really think the smarter option would be to sort out your disastrous energy policy. On top of that CBAM legislation, the European Commission has decided that they want to meddle even more. And honestly, I'm pretty convinced the fertilizer industry has a big part to play in both of these legislative decisions. The second decision is to impose tariffs, significant tariffs on Russia and Belarusian fertilizers, which basically means that the cheapest source of fertilizer in the world is no longer able to enter into Europe without seeing steep tariffs. That makes the European fertilizer industry less competitive and again drives up prices for us farmers. The price increase expected from this decision does vary a lot, but it could be anywhere from £20 to £100 a tonne. It is just mental that our politicians are so stupid. So my prediction for the future of fertilizer prices in Europe is pretty dire. Basically, get used to paying more for your fertilizer. And the reality is, if farmers have to foot that bill, some of that cost will end up on consumers and make food prices more expensive. And I promise you, the ones who are going to benefit from all of this is going to be the fertilizer industry. One of my favorite facts to illustrate the reality that the only thing the fertilizer industry cares about is their profits is that when the gas price soared in 2022 and all of us farmers were paying £800 a tonne on the guise of how expensive energy price was, Yara and the fertilizer industry never actually paid them high gas prices because they had fixed their gas price beforehand. And the price gouging resulted in CF Industries, Yara and Origin in the UK making £5.45 billion in profit. A 500% increase on 2021 before the Ukraine war. And in my personal opinion, the fertilizer industry got a taste of the immense profit they could make through market disruption, and that is why they have been so active in lobbying the European Commission and our local governments for bad policy decisions which will drive up prices. Drive up prices and drive up profits for their shareholders. And you know what the craziest thing is? That same lobbying by the fertilizer industry and bad policy decisions is not just happening at an EU level, it's also happening at a local level. The decision that Ireland has made to ban urea in 2026 is a great example. And the Department of Agriculture here in Northern Ireland is also planning to do the same, to ban the global commodity fertilizer. They are banning it under the guise of carbon emissions and ammonia emissions, but the research they're using to do it is fundamentally wrong. But we'll set that to one side for now, and instead we will focus on the market implications of banning straight urea fertilizer. Over 80% of the world's nitrogen comes from urea fertilizer, which means that it is a commodity product. And that global commodity product has a big impact on the prices that we pay here in the UK and Ireland. In 2023, the price of fertilizer collapsed and it caught a lot of fertilizer suppliers out. And the reason fertilizer prices collapsed at the start of 2023 was because of a global urea surplus. That cheap global urea flowing into the EU is what forced the EU fertilizer companies to drop their price. And if as farmers we lose that low cost benchmark, we are going to end up paying higher prices. Higher prices which are independent from the global market and are set by European fertilizer companies, set at a price where they can make more money. And this is even more important for small island nations like Ireland and the UK. We already have an incredibly monopolistic fertilizer industry. It's essentially controlled by 3 or 4 big players. And if we lose access to the global commodity fertilizer, I can promise you it is going to have a huge impact on the fertilizer market and be very detrimental to farmers. So even if you don't use urea fertilizer, believe me, you're going to be seriously impacted by this insanely stupid decision. So to summarize, the fertilizer price has increased in part because of higher energy costs, because of a totally dysfunctional EU energy system. But there is a big amount of the price increases that we are currently seeing locally are just pure profit taking. The fertilizer prices are expected to remain where they are for the rest of the year. However, if demand is lackluster or China starts to export more to increase supply, there will be some downward pressure on fertilizer prices. So essentially, just buy what you need when you need it. One other big thing which could really upset all of them predictions is how the Ukraine war negotiations go. Personally, I think there could be a ceasefire in Ukraine pretty soon, and that would have a significant downward pressure on fertilizer price. Longer term, there is a lot of upward pressure on fertilizer price, not driven by energy markets, but rather driven by stupid government policy. There really isn't going to be an easy solution to bring European fertilizer prices back in line with the rest of the world. You're trying to turn the tide on a catastrophic energy policy and an obsession with net zero. That is not going to happen quickly, but I do think eventually it will happen. And one of the things that we as farmers could perhaps do to contribute to that transition back to a sense of reality and prosperity for our citizens is point out that if you increase fertilizer prices, you're going to increase food prices. And a really great example of that is banning urea fertilizer. By banning urea fertilizer, you are achieving so little in terms of carbon emission reductions, and you achieve so little in terms of ammonia reduction. But banning urea will have a significant impact on the cost of production for farmers, which ultimately will work its way through to food prices. It is a bad environmental policy that is going to have significant impacts on every single person living in our country. And framing bad policy decisions in that kind of way could actually make a difference. I have a nosebleed. This has stressed me out this much. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you find some of that interesting and useful. I will see you next week when we will definitely be in the fields sowing our fertilizer that we have talked so much about. And yes, it absolutely will be straight, unprotected urea.